Hello, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Don't, I mean.
Yes, Prof.
Good. Hello is the number for you. Good. So we are last piece of the market page, and in particular, what we are talking about today is exactly follows what we said last time, and it was related to failures of the market on both demand and supply side, which means all those issues that gives problem of distribution of income, and from which we can notice that some people in the population that we are considering are possibly below a threshold considered a poverty line. In that case, what we talk about, I intend those studying public finance, is a problem which must be corrected because the market, for some reasons, depending on the joint failures on demand and supply side, does not guarantee an equal distribution of income, or I wouldn't say equal, I would just say acceptable, and that there are some that are absolutely below the level of poverty. What we do in this case is a sort of acknowledge that there are some needs in the population that are called redistributive needs, that in a way the collectivity belonging to a given economy recognize to others and decides as a joint decision, democratic decision, that, for instance, it's not acceptable that there are people below the level of poverty lines and they must be sustained in some ways. Or, for instance, recognize that everybody in a given collectivity has the right of health, whatever it means. But our constitution, for instance, in Italy, you are not all Italian, you are from abroad, I don't know exactly what your constitution says, but our constitution recognizes to everybody the right of health. What does that mean in practice for public finance? It means that in some cases, the government, under the mandate of the collectivity, has to guarantee that all the people belonging to a given collectivity have to be sustained if they cannot afford the expenses of, say, administrative dismissing right. The second point is, if there is this problem in a market economy, which, as you can see now, is not so perfect, because we have seen that there are a lot of failures of the market. What government should do in order to be effective in solving some problem of the population? Well, the first point to be considered is that if the collectivity of a given state wants to guarantee that certain rights are solved or that people be living in poverty have to be sustained in some way, the simplest way that we can think of is giving them money. It's a matter of redistribution. And I can use policy of transfer. This is used, for instance, in Italy. There is a measure that is called citizenship income, reddito di cittadinanza, is the Italian word, which means that the government recognizes that in certain situations people might need money to live, and give money to the population. What is the problem with this simple measure, which is not actually a good or services, which is our point at the moment? The point could be something like that. Could be afforded. Can you see it on the board? No.
Yes, Prof. Yes.
Assuming that the problem is only a problem of income, and look, we have in the horizontal axis the income of the individual, okay, and in the vertical axis the tax revenue, and quite often the government decided to tax income in order to get money to finance public expenditure, okay? And for instance, in this case, the government has decided to tax all those people having an income over P, over this point from here, with a flat tax, which is proportional of a given proportion. And if applied, it gives an income, a revenue to the government, which is equal, say, in point K. Those having an income equal to point K are taxed so that the government has a revenue equal to TK, okay, and so on. The line PK represents what the government can obtain by taxing income with a flat tax, which is proportional to a given amount of revenue above P. So, what happens to those which are in the class of income going to 0 to P? Those below, say, the poverty line. Assume that this point P is the level, the threshold that indicates the poverty line of a country. And those below that line are normally not taxed. And sometimes the government acts without taxing them. But one point that is discussed in the literature, for instance, there is an important approach which is due to Milton Friedman, who was a Nobel Prize for economics of the University of Chicago, that supported the view that with the use of a flat tax like this, those living below the level of the poverty threshold are negatively taxed, which means that below the income equal to P, those having any income in this part, which are now marked with green, should receive a negative tax, which is in a way a subsidy. So it means that low P, for instance, they receive an income which is equal to the green line. Okay, it means that, for instance, if I have at 0 point, I have an income equal high income are taxed, and I give part of the income, the revenue that I receive to those that are poor. Is that good? Can you think it is acceptable? Well, anyway, now we are assuming that the population wants it, and it's not. But we also have a different problem because we are using an instrument which might have some problem, which is taxation. So what would happen if I use this measure in order to help poor people of our population? There's a problem for those Italian who are here that was debated a lot during the story related to the citizenship income in Italy. The point was, is that true that the government gives money to those who are poor, so poor that cannot afford? Or does it create incentive or disincentive of any type in the economy if I'm using a measure like this. Because remind first that if I decide to tax those even for rich people, the point of, in general, all over the world, people are not happy to pay taxes because it means taxation means in the market that one who has worked for all one solar year. At a certain point, the government will say, well, look, now half of your income, you give me half of your income and I use it for paying whatever. So are you happy with this measure? And in general, people are not happy with this measure. If they could, they would not pay tax. Not even in terms, I'm not thinking of those who evade the tax, but even in principle, if I notice that the government of this country says, well, look, this is your wage, I want to tax the 80% of your tax, I'm not so happy. No? And I'm starting, well, I should work less. Because if the 80% of what I'm earning goes to the government to pay whatever, I might not be, I'm not so happy in principle. What about you? So there is the other side also of the story. Those who are in this part, I put it in red, and the interval around the poverty threshold, which kind of incentive I have to looking for a job? Look at those having an income which is just 10 euros below the poverty level. And they know that having an income below just of 10 euros, the poverty level, they will receive a subsidy from the government because they are poor. Would you have, if it was you, would you have the incentive to look for a job to have an income above the poverty level of 10 euros? If the amount is so small that you, it doesn't help. So which kind of incentive I'm giving to those which are below the poverty line to look for a job, for instance, if they could? Maybe they are adjust or find it in the black economy or try not to pay taxes. But even in this part here, they are not in any incentive to pass above the poverty line. By the way, those who are taxed above the poverty line might have the incentive if their income is very low to renounce to it because they know that because of this very small income, they are losing a subsidy from the government without doing anything. So in most countries in which this measure was used as a standard measure of the distribution, it did not work. And this point was very clear even to the Italian government when we decided to create citizen income. But the problem in that case was an enormous crisis of world dimension that could not avoid income transfer. But in principle, the point that was discussed is what are people doing with this income? So, because if they do use for eating or for sending the children at school or for medicines or whatever, it might be good that I give them income. But now government is in a market economy is in the position of controlling the consumer expenditure of people receiving the income. So if they start buying useless things or whatever, or drink alcohol, for instance, the first time that this kind of measure was used in Britain, they applied the negative taxation as a measure for redistribution. But in principle, seeing these measures directed to those families which are less affluent or poor with problem, in most cases related to alcohol, drugs, or the like. The money that households received were not spent for growing children or send them to school or the like, but if there was one people that wanted to drink alcohol, all the money was spent for this kind of consumption. And for instance, did you know, by the way, which are the first things that one very poor people, one coming to Italy with a ship from North Africa in an illegal way because possibly is escaping from a war or the like, and look, it's even true for those Italians below the poverty line. As consumer, I think. So you arrive in Italy, you are nothing, you are in a ship. Quite dangerous, you arrive from North Africa, with whatever, Libya or the like. And you arrived in Sicily without nothing. What is the first thing that one coming in this condition in Italy wants to buy? What is the first thing that poor people want to buy? Have you any idea? Even at home. Food. Anything? Sorry?
And they want to earn money.
They have the money. I'm using this measure with the poorest people that I can imagine in Italy, arriving here. And I give them money. What is the first things that they buy? The first things that they buy.
They want food.
No.
No.
An idea. It goes from computer, telephone, iPhone. So the first thing is being connected. And this is quite expensive. And for instance, and this is also true for the Italian living below the poverty threshold, which is one of the consumer expenditure at the top of the Istat is the Italian National Statistic Office that make the study the consumption bundle of consumers, also depending on the level of income. But what they buy are tools like this, and there is not even a great care of children in cases of families below the poverty line. So there is this problem. So what is prepared in order to avoid this sort of untargeted money transfer for those less affluent? One alternative to distribution, transfer of income, giving money to them, is that giving them goods and services, which is called this measure distribution in kind. So instead of giving the less affluent families money in order to buy and book for children, food, I give them directly the goods that they need. For instance, I allow less affluent households to send their children to school without paying anything, or I buy the book for them, or I support them for any healthcare expenditure. And this measure is called distribution in kind, which is one considered one of the measures considered that is in general preferred to other point of distribution. Now, but if the government is using this sort of measure, which is called, I remind you, distribution in kind, it might work more or less, it is in general preferred, but in some cases, what happens is that those who are expected to finance this measure, if it becomes so important that the amount of taxes paid by those who are rich, who are in the position to pay taxes, and if they perceive this measure in too heavy, it might well happen that there is a kind of fight internal to any given country. What I'm talking about, this is a kind of reaction that occurs all the time, that, for instance, there are countries like Italy, for instance, where there is a quite strong cleavage between North and South, where there is a North, Central North, which is quite rich, and the South that, as measured in GDP, is not so rich, and in principle received this sort of measure. In the United Kingdom, it happens quite often at the opposite. The South is richer than North of UK. So in general, those paying taxes are those belonging to the South that finance measure for the North. And if there is also this regional division, which means that, for instance, for some reason, of any kind, the development of a given country is not homogeneously distributed in the country. What happens is that someone might become a bit disappointed of paying tax without receiving in exchange what they believe to be the right amount of goods and services that normal people want to receive by the government. And there might be a sort of what is called, this is called, even in English, it's a kind of fiscal revolution, which means there might be some people that support the view that given that those paying tax are not receiving an equal, or what I consider equal amount of goods and services, they react to this policy of the government by simply not paying tax. And in this case, it's sort of fiscal revolution, which now is occurring, is a policy that in general is mostly supported in Italy, for instance, by those parties like the Lega Nord, but in France by the Le Pen, or in the UK by what's the name of the party which was belonged to the Sovereignist group. I'm seeing the face, but I don't remember the name of the leader. Anyway, there is a sort of reaction to the policy, and what could happen? That what can be the solution in this case? Well, the solution is not very easy because it depends on what, at the end of the day, the population decides as majority policy to be followed by the government in charge. But one way to solve this sort of problem could be that of fiscal federalism. What does it mean? It means that what we have considered and all the story that I've told you up to now is a kind of public economy that intervene in the market of the country, taken as a whole. Look, assuming that it is Italy, that is more or less like this, but also twice, okay? There's a small house there. It looks more or less like it. Now, I was talking of a government policies that public intervention that was devoted to all the country in a way, in an homogeneous way. But as soon as we have redistributive problem inside the country, one way to solve this problem is that of, in a way, decomposing the country in small group and small, I wouldn't call them countries because it's not. In order to have inside of each part of the country a sort of uniform policy that for certain goods is financed directly from the citizen of that bit of the country. This is a sort of federal way of shifting the country in part, so that someone believes each citizen of a given bit finances the good that the subnational level is providing to its collectivity. What is the advantage of it? The advantage could be that if this issue will be afforded in states by Luisa Giuliano beginning next week. But the point is that of receiving, using the taxation as a sort of price for the public services that individuals are receiving. Is that clear? What I'm saying? It's not a rhetorical question. Is it clear what I'm saying? No. Now, beginning with from where? Where is the point that I noticed that your faces are not exactly those of people following me. Where is the point that is not clear? Hello? So up to now, I have talked about market failure, and the remedy for market failure can be those requiring public intervention in the economy, which might be of different types. It might be either with direct production, provision, indirect provision of goods, regulation of the market. In a way, the government try to solve all those cases in which the market doesn't work. And depending on the situation, either in case of market failure on the supply side or on the demand side, we can think of a sort of homogeneous policy of the government all over a given country. Okay, this is clear. And for instance, the government can decide that in the presence of some indivisibility, it can act in a given way. For instance, he becomes the producer of a given good. And it is the producer all over the country of that even good, because any government intervention is generally supported by a national law. Okay, so as a policy valid all over the country. So in the presence of goods that are and services that are going to solve those failures that are their origin and redistributive needs, where there is a kind of inequality spreads among the population. What can well happen is that whatever is the kind of intervention that might be thought, either with an income redistribution by means of transfer, this one of the negative taxation, or a kind of redistribution in kind, as it is called, which means that I don't give directly money to the population, but I give them goods and services that in a way empower the population to reach certain results and survive, for instance. I don't give money to buy food, but I give directly food. I don't give money to buy medicines, I give them medicines in order to avoid a situation in which they buy something different of what can be considered more important. Now, in all those situations in which there are problems like this, and I would say this is the case of most now developed countries, because after the last two crises, either that of the Lehman Brothers beginning in 2007, and then the pandemic crisis, economic crisis. This is the problem is spread for almost all the developed countries. This sort of measure can generate conflict. And for instance, those which are required to finance the measure of the government might not be happy to pay all those money that go directly to those who are poor in the population when they remain without any good public good or services that they would like in any case. Okay, is it clear? This happens, and there is not a considered fair return from the amount of taxes paid by affluent individuals in terms of goods and services that even they need. For instance, health is one of those needs which is spread for everybody. But it's not only a need for poor people. It's a need almost for everybody, even those rich. And we are in a country, if we think of the Italian people, where public health is guaranteed by almost all the population. And for instance, the public Italian system has shown some problems because a number of people said that this is not good enough because government doesn't spend enough money for the health system, where they spend it. And why, for instance, pay the citizen income where at the same time the health system is not guaranteed for all the rest of the population? This is kind of conflict that we have in any country, where, as usual, the money available for the government are never enough. So the government never have enough money for all the needs of the population. So the point is, why the government spends money for the citizen income, that one of the negative income tax, instead of increasing the expenditure for health that could could be really improved and is in favor of all the citizens. This is a standard question which we can find in the political debate. Or why don't the government spend money for education instead of giving money to the poor? That then we discovered that, for instance, they were not so poor, but were simply tax evaders. This is another standard issue that you find. And this is the first story, and that can generate a kind of conflict inside a country. The second issue is that when the government acted in a homogeneous way all over the country, the different needs of different parts of the population in general cannot be satisfied completely. Because, for instance, go back to our map of Italy, people living close to Rome, here, we'll make green part of Lazio. Those people living here might have needs which are completely different from those who living at the border with Austria. Here, Roma and Lazio are quite old part of Italy. There is the sea. They are very old. There is mountain, and the needs might be quite different for them, which are even different from those living in the island, having completely different needs. As for the demand for goods and services that government can provide. So what can be the solution if I have this sort of conflict inside a collectivity? One solution would be that of, in a way, splitting the country into parts that can be geographically located in different ways, and there is no a clear way to divide, to how to divide according to the theory geographically the country, but in a way the point is splitting in a way economically rational the country so that the public intervention is directed and targeted to the population exactly living in that part of the country. And the story works like it's called the club theory, which means that exactly it is as if I divided the country into clubs, like the golf club, the tennis club, the whatever club, and as it happens in the club, people pay a tax to be admitted to the club, and the club gives them goods and services. For instance, I want to play tennis, and I know I live in Rome, but Rome is not too good with the tennis because it provides me only what else golf. I don't like it. What can I do? I can look for in the country or in this area if there is a tennis club that provides me the services that I want. And if I find it, say in Tuscany, which I know very well, I don't play tennis, by the way, in this part of Italy, I move from my residence and go to that club, which could be the region, Tuscany, that provide, I pay taxes there, local taxes, and then the regional government gives me all the opportunity to play tennis. It gives me, I don't know how many places where to play. All the facilities are not playing tennis, so I don't know the kind of facilities that are needed to play. But you can imagine something, no? What happens to tennis game? And in that case, I paid that taxes there, and I received back all what I need from the local government. Okay, how does the model work? And in particular, what is the assumption that makes the government work like this? Notice that this is at the basis of fiscal federalism. And it's more or less a situation that it can be very often applied to those federal states like United States that are quite often referred to a tier like this in order to justify the federal states inside the United States. So when a system like this can work in economic terms, because if you think, no, we have about 60 million population living in Italy, and we have millions of people that look for something different. Each of them have their own personal interest or look for something that government should give them. And what I can do, if I divide, and given that they are mostly different, what can I think of doing? I, for instance, generate club, this is why the theory is called theory of club, where in each club I provide the goods and services that few or many citizens want. And what happens in this situation? If I live in a country where all those citizens living there are fully mobile, which means that they can go wherever they find the goods and services that the government can provide them. So consumers are fully mobile. They are completely informed about any good or services provided by each of the club spread all over the country. For instance, another assumption, as you will see, this kind of assumption that I'm telling you, are repeating more or less exactly the assumption of the competition. So another one is the completeness of the market. So if there is one consumer or citizen that strongly want the goods, in that country there is definitely one club who is able to provide that good to that citizen. For what else? Another situation which is important for the equilibrium is that even if each club provides them one or more given good that they want, there are not spillover or spill-in effect between different clubs. I mean that if Tuscany and Lazio, which are close to each other, produce one, I said before that Tuscany is providing tennis and Lazio is providing what? Swimming pool. The benefit or external effect do not spill over from Lazio to Tuscany. So it means that there are no external effects coming from playing tennis from Tuscany to Lazio, and vice versa. There are no spillover effects from Lazio to Tuscany. So in each club, the benefit fallout is contained inside. What else? There are not economy of scale. All the consumers are willing to pay the exact amount of taxes necessary to finance the goods that they want. Oh, well, and there are, I forgot to say something. The perfect mobility of consumption of consumers means that there are no problems from, from the consumer side to move inside the country. For instance, going from Sicily to Veneto here without losing job. If I know that if I move from here to there, I don't have problem of finding again a job. And now also I don't have problem, which makes this model very useful for Italy. I don't have problem if I move from from Veneto to Sicily because of my house. So sometimes people don't want to move because say, well, I own my house in Sicily, I don't want to go to Venice, no? I look for a job, but simply because I like that club. This is not a problem. It doesn't fit very well to Italy, but it definitely fits very much better to United States and to the federal model, where, for instance, the problem of mobility is less important than the Italian. So what are the citizens doing in this sort of club, state of club, moving? They are actually, it's called the modern voting by feet. So I'm in Lazio, I don't like Lazio, I don't have problem of mobility. If I don't like the goods and services provided by Lazio, I vote by feet and move to Tuscany without any problem. Or move to Liguria, Lombardy, what they like, or Calabria, whatever. I can choose exactly like in the market. I can choose exactly that club, which is a sub-level government, because it is inside a country, a biggest country in which public economy works. And this is more or less what happens, for instance, for the health system in Italy, where we have a sort of central government that only look at what we call the essential level of assistance. So at the second point, we have some kind of reform, which was it was not the first big reform of the Italian health system. It occurred at the beginning of this century, and in which it was decided by a change of constitution that as for those who are called essential level of assistance, they were to be decided by the central government. It means that for a certain level of disease, important one, by the way, or for certain kind of treatment, the central government decides the standard. For all the rest, even for all the rest of problems related to the kind of organization of the health system, everything was devoted to the regional level, who decided exactly how to organize the system. And at the moment in Italy, we have quite a different situation for health. For instance, we have a kind of a prevailing private system in this part of Italy, which includes Lombardy, where, in spite of the fact that the health assistance is public and is public financed, the producer, the direct production of the services is done by private entrepreneurs. And this is a model that used to be considered very good until up to the pandemic point. then we have seen that we have experienced that it was not so good because it was at a very high level of assistance for very strange case or for those very specialistic assistance, but it was missing completely the standard domestic assistance of the general practitioner, which in normally is very low. It's very low level. And we have seen that, for instance, going in a different model who was here in Veneto, if you live in Ezzagiulia, in that case, the kind of assistance was very fractioned among the population. There was a quite strong support and diffusion of the services among the population with a number of general practitioners reaching personally and also all the population that in the case of the pandemic was quite definitely better than the Lombardy system. Then there is this part of Italy here, that one, which is Emilia-Romagna, which is traditionally a mixed system of public and public supply of health services, which is still different from the Toscan model. So, in any context, those were the decisions taken are often most possibly suited to the needs of the population, according to a federal model that finds its origin, at least in the theory, but you will see a number of details, which is Giuliano in the theory of Gleb. And so, with this part of redistributive needs and problems that can occur in case of the distribution, but this is not the only motivation for fiscal federalism. And of course, you will exploit the rest of the reports. I now switch to from part related to public goods and market failure to the focus on excise taxation, which is something that you need in order to afford the issues of the solution to the problem of bugs that we have to consider. And the point that I want to afford now is that of excise taxation, which is the basic instrument used by governments that want to in a way address some consumer behavior that is not considered correct. And as I mentioned when last Tuesday, when we were talking about both cigarettes or alcohol or food, there are two basic instruments that government can use in order to addressing consumer behavior. One is persuasion, and it can be by means of advertisement. And we like to talk about the effect of advertisement in the policy against some against the consumption of drugs. The other instrument is taxation, in particular excise taxation, which is a way through which government can intervene exactly in the price of different goods and services of which wants to address won't be relevant in the choice of consumers. So what we are doing now and the next time is looking at how exactly this instrument basis of public intervention, my work in order to correct some consumer behavior. Well, look, when I show you this bit of the story, no, wait, this one. I was thinking of taxation was taxable basis is income, which is income taxation is in general in most countries the main source of revenues for government. And for instance, in Italy, personal income taxation is that giving the highest amount of revenue money at the government in order to pay expenditure, to finance expenditure. And excise taxation is not something related to income, which is based on a different principle. What we are talking now, given the fact that taxes that price can have on the choice of consumer, we are looking at those taxes that directly affect the price of goods and services in order to see whether and how much, by the way, I can use these instruments in order to avoid, say, some behavior. So what we are talking about is that called excise taxation that I think you already know what I'm going to talk about, but just to be sure, I just show something that might be of help or remind something that definitely you should already know. And I just want to show first, based on the consumer decision, which is the effect on consumer decision, assuming consumers rational, taking their decision on the basis of their preferences and their income. What happens when the consumer decides about which kind of food he wants to buy? What happens when the government decides to put the tax in one of the goods that the consumer wants to buy? Okay, and this is the fact that I want to show. There are mainly two basic effects which are important for taxation. And well, start with the story, the basic story. We are in a situation, we start from here. Now we have, I pass with yellow, a consumer that can choose between two goods, X1 and X2. Given a given amount of money that they can devote either to one or the other or to both as a linear combination. So if our consumer at the beginning has an income that constrains his choice. He has an income equal to 0. No. 0. And if he buys all the good X2, he can at least buy this amount of the goods. Okay? If he buys only X1 good, he can at least buy this. Okay? The linear combination of this line that the passive letter is the different combination of X1 and X2 that our consumers can buy in this market given the relative prices of the good. The relative prices are represented in this picture by the slope of the line R0, this one, which is called budget line. You already know this. Okay, good. Now, what happens is that given all this combination of X1 and X2 good, what happens if the government decides to tax this good with a quite heavy tax? I decided that I want to tax this good at about a very high level, given that if I introduce a taxation on good X1, taking leaving as given X2, my monetary income doesn't change, but I can buy less of the good that with respect to the case in which there was no taxation. So after taxation, the maximum amount that I can buy, so look, it's very big taxation. If I only buy X1 with respect to the beginning, where I could buy this amount here, now I can buy this amount here, so quite big, quite I have a reduction of about half the amount of the good. What happens if good 2 has not taxed it? In the absence of good 1, I can still buy the same amount of the good. So my budget constraint after taxation becomes this one. Okay. Now, assume that at the beginning, the equilibrium was E0. Now I clean on my PPT. The equilibrium was here, E0, where this curve is the indifference curve of our individual that maximizing his welfare, choose the highest indifference curve tangent to the budget line. Okay, you already know stuff. And what happens after taxation? The new equilibrium, the individual have to find a different equilibrium because it maximizes his utility subject to the budget constraint. And now the budget constraint is not longer R0, but it is becoming R1. So I have to find the highest different curve, which is tangent to R1. And the equilibrium will be, as you can see, and this a different curve that I'm marking with yellow at point A1. Okay, what happens? What is the result of this taxation? So we are in a world where each consumer can maximize his preference subject to the budget constraint. In our world, there are only two goods, 1 and 2, and the consumer is always in the position of optimizing. At first, he chooses A0. After taxation, it goes to A1. What happens in this case? What is the effect of taxation for this consumer? Well, look, we are quite funny. No, it's not at all less fun. But anyway, where this effect? This is the initial equilibrium where the consumer has the consumption of X1 0. After the taxation, the consumer passed to X1 price. So this is the result for the taxed good, because government decided to put only a tax on X1. What happens to good 2? There was a change unexpected that the government would have liked, because it decided, well, look, I want to stop cigarette, and I put a quite big taxation on cigarette. What is the effect in the market? That over the other goods who are not were excluded by taxation, find something changed, and in particular, given the amount of taxation so big, what happens was that the consumer increases the consumption of the other goods. But this was not exactly what the government wants, because in general, if the market works, government wants to stop what happens in the market for bad. But would not like to affect all the other markets because it is considered not the proper way to modify consumer preferences. Might be happy that if the income is spent on other goods, but look, if this is X1 and X2 only, it might well be that those producing some other food are not so happy that the favor due to taxation, because of taxation of X1 goes to something that is complementary to that good, for a substitute good for cigarette. For instance, the government decide to only tax cigarette, and I have cigarette and cigar here, or cigarette and cannabis. This is the alternative for this consumer. And the government decides it cannot tax cannabis because it is illegal, and just tax cigarette. But due to the reduction of the price of cigarette, the government is increasing the demand for the cannabis, which is something that doesn't sound very good, mainly because it might be even worse, or think it is ecstasy or cocaine after life. So the indirect effect of taxation of just one good can be even worse than the original. So what we want to do now, what we want to see, and whether, no, is actually we want to see a decomposition of the effect of taxation in only one good present in this market. And in particular, we want to disentangle the different effect on the reduction of X1, the decrease of X1, of X2, due to the two main effects, which are income effect and substitution effect. So, notice first which is the total effect of taxing only one good with an excise tax on X1. The total effect at the end of the day is this one. What I observe in the market is a switch from X1 zero to X1 prime. Okay? So I have this reduction. But the point is that this reduction is due to two different effects. One is what we call income effect, and it's the effect that government likes. People buy less X1 simply because they have less money, less income. So because I take some of their income every time that they buy X1. So having less income, they buy less goods. And this is something that government wants. What the government doesn't want is what is called substitution effect. Given that good one is becoming, in terms of relative prices, with respect to the other only existing good X2 in the market, relatively more convenient. These consumers, as a consequence of taxation, is switching its consumption to good too, that government did not want to tax. And look, this is a very serious thing because it gives, now we will see exactly what happens in terms and how big is substitution effect and income effect. But in a way, it gives you an idea of how distorted can be the tax instrument in the market. And consider this situation. Now, assume that instead of cigarette, here we have X1 is fresh fruit, and X2 is cannabis. Okay. The government make a mistake. With all these committees suggesting a good policy, I think that fresh fruit is something absolutely bad for consumers. okay, and decides to tax fresh fruit instead of cannabis. It cannot tax cannabis because it is illegal, so not taxing cannabis now, it taxes fresh fruit. Now, what happens? We have this situation that you are already seeing in the picture. So the equilibrium for the individual consumer consuming at the same time fresh fruit and cannabis switch passes from X0 to X1. Okay, this is the story. Now, government discovered that at a certain point that its policy was completely crazy and that taxing fresh fruit was a disaster for it, and decided not only to stop with taxation, but also to give back money to the consumer that used to to this consumer that at the beginning was using fresh fruits and then was taxed and reduced its consumption of fresh fruit. Okay, what the government can give back to the consumer that after the consumer has changed its consumption? Is the government in the position of giving back an amount of money that makes the consumer to be as good as it was before taxation? This is the big problem that we have, because if the government wants to make this policy and discover I'm crazy in my mind, I taxed fresh fruit, it was very healthy, and so I'll give back to this consumer all the amount of taxes he has already paid. How big is the amount of taxes that the government can give back to this consumer? Can you see this in the picture? So we are at equilibrium. We are passing from year to year. Can you see in this picture the amount of revenues of taxes that this individual has paid to the government? Possibly not. Because the point is that government can give back only the amount of money he has really in the pocket, but cannot give back what he considers to be the revenue, the hypothetical revenue. And because of the substitution effect and because of the fact that due to taxation on fresh fruit, our consumers, when deciding, have switched his preference and increased the amount of cannabis to be consumed. So not exactly all the amount that government, due to the reduction of X1, can be given back to the consumer. And exactly in my pocket, I'm playing as a government. What enters in my pocket as a government, measured in terms of X1, is exactly this amount here, which can be found if I move from E0 up to the original indifferent school. In the place, scusate, the original budget line. So I have at the beginning this budget line. After taxation, I have this budget line. So from the equilibrium, moving horizontally, I shift up to the point in which I found the original consumer budget constraint. And that distance, which is E1T, is the amount of money. Well, it is the amount of revenue measured in terms of the good X1, which has been pocketed by the government. So it also means that the government cannot make the consumers at the same level it was before taxation. Now, going to the point in which we are, that's the picture. In which we try to disentangle the effect of taxation that we don't like, that we find every time we are using taxation, and how to measure that those effects that I called income and substitution effect. So the expression is almost close to the former, and we make an exercise that is called compensating variation in terms of welfare. So now we assume as before, zero is exactly the position we had before with an indifference curve, which is this one, marked yellow. And there is a quite big taxation from which the government is taxing X1 quite heavy, and the budget constraint passes from R0 to R1, where there is an increase of relative prices that we can see in the picture by the different slope of the budget constraint, which is at first P0, where P0 in absolute value is the ratio between the price of good X2 and the price of good X1. And in this case, P prime, this one, in absolute value, not C, is the higher price, relative price of X1 with respect to X2. As you can see, the slope here in those cases is higher than the original. Okay, it means that the relative price of X1 is higher than before. So the equilibrium passes from E0 to E1. It's exactly the same picture. What happens if now I make an exercise of this kind? So I have reduced the welfare of an individual because, as you can see, it passes from the highest difference score I could reach with the income R0 to a lower level, in a lower indifference score. Now, after the new equilibrium has been reached by this individual in E1, how much must I compensate that individual to make that individual as well as as it was before taxation? So what happens here? With the introduction of taxation, I have changed the relative price, the vector of prices that determines the equilibrium in this market. Now, the relative price are changed and as those of the budget line R1. Now, after having changed the relative price at this new relative price, how much should I give to compensate that individual in terms of bringing in at the same level of welfare it was before taxation? Is that clear? So what I want to do, I cannot make this individual to reach the point E0 given the new price level, because the slope is different. So it's you could never find a line with the slope equal to P prime, which is tangent to E0. But what I can do is a shift of this budget line, and I shift this budget line parallel to the original. And when do I stop? I stop when I have reached the original indifference curve, this one. In so doing, I'm compensating this individual in terms of welfare, because I'm giving to him enough money to reach an equilibrium A2, which is in the same indifference pool as it used to be, as E0, which used to be the original equilibrium in the same indifference pool. And if I want to measure the amount that I gave to this individual, that amount here, who is called compensating variation, which is measured in terms of good X2, is the amount of good X2 that I have to give him in order to compensate it for the loss that he has suffered because of taxation. Now, after this exercise at point E2, this one, at the new equilibrium, I can find a different point. So we have the original, which was the same as before, x1, 0, the original consumption of x. X1 prime is that is the consumption of x after taxation of x. And x1 second is the amount of x after having compensated that individual for the welfare loss he suffered because of taxation. Now, this new point of equilibrium adds up to split the total effect of taxation into two terms. The first bit, this one going from x1 prime to x1 second, this bit here, is the income effect, which means that the amount of variation which is only due to variation of market power, purchasing power. So the price increases and I can buy less. And this is called the income effect. In real terms, less income in order to buy X1. The second effect that I have, that is called the substitution effect, and it goes from x1 second to x1 0. And this green part, which is the kind of effect that is quite disturbing. Because on the one side, as I mentioned before, I'm increasing the price of the good, and I'm expecting that the consumer has a lower purchasing power and cannot buy the good. So I'm compensating this good, and I reasonably expect the income effect. What I don't like is the fact that it is not clear. It's due to the fact that this consumer can trade off between fresh fruit and cannabis. So, given that the relative price of cannabis with respect to fresh fruit are changing, I increase in this case the amount of cannabis that is smoked because of a simple mistake. We will see also that in terms of optimal taxation, what we call the substitution effect is that it's a part of taxation that is something that government would not like, because as part of the measure that doesn't work properly in the market, at least not in the desired way. We skip the equivalent variation, but what we want to see now is is considering all the story of introducing taxation in terms not of individual consumer behaviors, but in terms of demand and supply price, because they are much more easy to be considered in the market, even from the government, if you want to tax alcohol or cigarettes or the like. as a quick reminder of how the demand curve, the individual demand curve is built, beginning from the preference, what we observe in the market, notice, but or even this one is a very simple reminder of something that you already know. What we observe in the market, the standard relation of the quantity of a given good and the price of the good, is that called Marshallian demand curve, which is not the only kind of demand. The name of the economist is Marshall, the same that we have already met. Now, how does the demand curve come from the preference of an individual which is rational? I consider the exercise that we did for taxation. I consider a world where we have only two goods, X1 and X2, but before. And we begin with a zero, and then there is an increase of price, and not necessarily due to taxation. And the equilibrium passes from A0 to A1. Now, are you aware of how can we build the demand curve? No, what happened? Just change. How can we build the demand curve beginning from the individual choices of an individual? Is it clear to you? So we are comparing from the individual point of view two different goods. And we are seeing here the equilibrium points, which are the result of a rational individual maximization of its own utility and subject to the budget constraint. But this is not the standard demand curve. Clearly, it's just in terms of indifference curve and the like. What we mean, we observe in the market is the demand curve, which is, however, related to it. And how can we build a demand curve living from this bit, this part? So we observe here that we have, if we make the price of X1 varying, say increasing, we have the lowest price, the original price P0, which was that generating the equilibrium is zero. At the price P equal to the at price P0, it is the relative price of X1 between X2 and X1. This individual used by was in equilibrium at the point X1, at the quantity X0, X1, 0. Okay. When the price increased, and for instance, the equilibrium passed from P0 to P1, this equilibrium, this individual choose a position P1, where the quantity of goods given the increased price, notice that P1 is greater than P0, the quantity at the increased price P1 was equal to X1 prime. Okay. Now, if I reverse this result in the picture below, where I have quantity here, quantity and price, quantity in the horizontal axis and prices in vertical axis, I see that when the price is equal to P0, this one, this slope, our individual buy a quantity which is equal to X1, 0. Okay. When the price increases and it goes up this slope, here, P1, which is bigger than P0, like this one. The quantity that the individual has bought is X1 prime, this one. And if I do this exercise, I'll make it green. For all the different price that I can consider, that means that I consider I'm making variation only of the price of one good, keeping all the others unmodified. What I see is the standard demand curve that I can observe in the market, which is individual. It is the standard individual demand, which depends on preference of the individual, because you know that all the equilibrium points are determined by the preferences of the individual between X1 and X2, and also depend on the income of the individual. It chooses different combinations depending on the price, equilibrium price. And so every time that price varies, I can have a relation between the quantity of the good considered and the given price. Did you know that this was the way in which the demand, the market demand for the good was passed? You should have. It's not a rhetoric question. Did you know that the demand for good one, in this case, demand intended as the relation between quantity and price, was determined in this way? Or you just took a given a demand with a negative slope and ciao? How many of you did already know that the demand curve was obtained in this way? It's a survey of the class in order to understand what your knowledge. No. Why nobody answered? Those in the class. How many of you have already heard about this story I'm telling you? Raise your hand. Have you heard about it? Did you know that the demand curve was obtained in this way? No. Just written that it was negative. How many at home?
Me, prof. Yes.
Yeah, also me.
Oh, meno male. At least two, which is not the majority, but I was a bit worried, but now I'm happy. So anyway, we have processed the time. On this basis, next time we will see the effect of specific tax and ad valorem tax on specific goods or services that are the way in which the excise taxation can become operative, and on which parts you could consider the different policy of the government. Okay, so see you on next Tuesday.